Hola, and welcome to our service. I'm so happy you are joining us today. My name is Gustavo Castañeda, and I am the pastor of Outreach in our Willow del Español community. If you are watching us for the first time or have recently joined our online community, we would love to know who you are. So please, would you take a moment to visit our website? You can click the I Knew button to learn a little bit about us. Fill out the connections card while you are there and tell us how we may help you get connected into our church family. Now, before we hear a message from our Generousville campus pastor, Johnny Johnston, I'd like to invite you into a time of worship. Psalm 86:12 says, I will praise you, Lord, my God, with all my heart. I will glorify your name forever. Let's glorify his name as we sing.
Nothing has the power to save. Well, hey everyone, my name is Johnny Johnston. I am the campus pastor at our Jennersville campus. So glad to have you with us, tuning in wherever you are and whatever time it is. We're just glad that you've chosen to spend some time working on your spiritual life with Jesus. So we are working through a series called Living God's Mission, where we're talking about our mission statement, where we love God, love each other, and love the world that Jesus, through his people, is working to restore. You know, so many of you have joined us in the last 12 to 18 months. Some of us, it's good for us to hear this refresher about our mission statement and why we do what we do. And for others of us, we just really need to hone back in and to really get a good refresher as to why we do the things that we do here at church. And we believe that our mission statement is actually God's mission. You know, this isn't something that we made up. It isn't something that we came up with. This is something that we believe God has placed in our world. He's placed it in our church, and he's placed it on our hearts. And so last week we talked about loving God. This week we're going to talk about what it means to love each other. Now, where does this come from, right? Again, we didn't make this up. It's biblical. And so we're going to look at Matthew 22, which is actually where we started last week as well. And it's going to sound a little different. It's not going to say love each other, but the heart behind it is the same. So let's look at Matthew 22, verses 34 through 40. It says this: "But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. 'Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?' And he said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. A second is like it: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets.'" Now, you'll notice, as I said, it's not the same language. This says that we love to love your neighbor as yourself. But again, it's the same heart behind it whenever we say that we are to love each other. Now, you'll notice here that when Jesus answers the question first, he first starts with love God, right? He says, this is the first and great commandment. And we would agree, right? This is a first and great commandment. We love God. But then when he says a second is like it, we hear a second and we think, oh, that must mean second place, or not as good as the first one. But there's a word here that actually lets us know that that's not exactly what Jesus is saying. It's this little word like, when Jesus says a second is like it. This word like in Greek actually means of equal rank. That means that loving your neighbor as yourself is of equal rank to loving God. Now, okay, does that really hold up throughout the scriptures? Well, in fact, it does. If you were to follow the footnote train, just like we did last week, right? Last week we talked about Matthew 22, and then we went to Deuteronomy 6 as we continue to talk about loving God. This week we go from Matthew 22 and we jump to Leviticus 19 to talk about what it means to love your neighbor as yourself, to love each other. Now, before you write this off, because Leviticus is probably the most skipped over book in the entire Old Testament, maybe in the entire Bible, we could say, Leviticus actually is incredibly deep. And the chapter we're going to look at today, or the portions that we're going to look at today from Leviticus 19, one scholar actually says that this is the highest development of ethics in the entire Old Testament. The highest development of ethics in the entire Old Testament. And it's not just about being a good person, okay? That's not what this is about. It's about being holy. Leviticus 19:2 says this. It says, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." In other words, the Israelites are to imitate God. This is what they're called to do. This is why it's such a high development of ethics, because God is holy and they're to imitate him and to be like him. So that's verse 2. But then verses 3 through 18, here's what we have. There's these different rules, right? These ethics about and commandments about how they're supposed to live and interact with each other. How the Israelites are to love each other, how they're to deal with each other, how they're supposed to solve problems, all of these different things. And interestingly enough, in these passages, verses 3 through 18, the 10 commandments get repeated in some form or fashion. Now, you might be thinking, okay, 10 commandments, like that's just a bunch of rules, right? Well, actually, the 10 Commandments are incredibly relational. Verses 1 through 3 talk about our relationship with God, or Commandments 1 through 3. Commandments 5 through 10 actually talk about our relationship with each other. And Commandment 4 is the Sabbath, which some people say actually is what connects the vertical to the horizontal, which is like a whole nother sermon in and of itself. But there's this high development of ethics again, and how they're supposed to treat each other, how they're supposed to love each other, how they're supposed to interact with one another. And something else that's really important in these passages is that at the end of every single one of the rules or the sentences or the little paragraphs, there's this phrase that gets repeated every time. And it's this, it says, I am the Lord, your God, or sometimes it just says, I am the Lord. Now, there's a reason for that, right? It's not because they have forgotten who's talking, right? The reason they do that is because he is the one that they are supposed to imitate, and he is holy. And they are to be holy just as he is holy. In other words, whenever it says something like, hey, this is how you're supposed to interact with each other, I am the Lord your God. This is the reason why you do this. God thinks so highly of the way that you love each other and treat each other that he's going to put his name on it. He's going to put his stamp on it, and you are to be holy just as he is holy. And this happens. This is how you treat each other. I am the Lord. This is how you treat each other. I am the Lord your God. And it just goes and goes, and it culminates all in verses 17 and 18. Here's what it says in Leviticus 19. It says, you shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. There it is, right? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is where Jesus gets this from in Matthew 22, the passage we just read a little bit ago. But we see this again, this high development of ethics where God puts a stamp on this, I am the Lord, right after he says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is deeply embedded throughout the scriptures. How important loving your neighbor as yourself is, how important it is to love each other. One thing I was reading actually this week says that the word for love and neighbor in the Hebrew here, and really in English as well, are just incredibly wide-ranging. In other words, it's not about us defining what love is or trying to define, well, who's the neighbor in this situation. What's really going on here is God is saying, hey, I am the Lord your God. Loving each other, loving your neighbor as yourself is so wide-ranging, is so important that you ought to just love, because this is one of the ways that you fulfill the law. And we see this in other spots too throughout the scriptures. We're just going to continue to kind of take this big, broad survey here. But if we jump to Romans 13, ahead into the New Testament again, right? Look at these words, Romans 13, verses 8 through 10. It says, let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be are summed up in this one command, love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. First of all, verse 8, oh my goodness. I feel like that should just be like a theme verse for all of us, right? Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. How beautiful is that? But then Paul says, right? Whoever loves has fulfilled the law. And then he goes on and he lists some of the 10 commandments, right? That should sound familiar because that just came from Leviticus, these highly relational ways that we treat one another, this development of ethics. And then he says, this is so important. He says, whatever other command there may be are summed up in this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. Whatever other command there is summed up in this, to love your neighbor as yourself. Love each other. It's so important. Love does no harm. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. And again, we see this in all of these different ways, how important it is to love each other. Last week, we looked at 1 John 4. And if we look at some of the passages again, we're going to see this theme of love, but specifically, last week we focused on loving God. what about loving each other in the midst of all this? 1 John 4 says, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Beloved, if God so loved us, we ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. We love because he first loved us. If anyone says, 'I love God,' and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him: whoever loves God must also love his brother." Right? He says love comes from God. Whoever loves has been born of God. Listen, this is even bigger, right? No one's seen God, but if we love one another, we make God visible not only to ourselves, but also to the world around us. And he goes even stronger and bolder in his language here. And he says something really important. He says that if you claim to be a Christian, but you do not love other people, love your brother, love your sister, you are a liar. I mean, that's bold, strong language, but it just goes to show you how important loving each other is in the scriptures and in our lives. We make God known whenever we love each other. And if we claim to be Christians but do not love each other, John tells us we're just liars. That's pretty big and pretty important. I mean, and this theme, again, just continues throughout the scriptures. I mean, so a lot of us are reading through the book of Acts right now, right? During this sermon series, we've been doing a chapter a day in the book of Acts. And what we see in Acts over and over again is this community being formed as the church starts and they're learning what it means to love each other, to care for one another's needs, to be in each other's spaces. Even the New Testament as a big major theme. One of the things that we often don't see, but really has a lot to do with each other, is that most of the yous, the Y-O-U's in the New Testament, are actually plural. It's written to groups of people. It's not written to individuals. It's written to this community of loving your neighbor as yourself and loving each other. The yous are plural. You know, for you Philly folks, it's yous guys. Or for the Southerners, it's y'all. And for me being from Pittsburgh, it's yins. This is what it is, loving each other. Loving your neighbor as yourself is just of equal rank to loving God. And it is so heavily important throughout the scriptures. But here's something we need to wrestle with. If this command, and yes, it is a command, is so important, if it's so relevant to our lives, why is it so hard to do? I mean, why do we have to be commanded to do this? I mean, well, first, let's give a nod to sin, right? Because sin, you know, a lot of times when we think of sin, we just think of bad behaviors that we do. But sin is something that comes and just grabs onto everything good that God created, including community and relationships. And so not only does sin infect our lives, infect and affect our lives individually, but sin also has a lot to do because it affects our relationships as well. And so there are a bunch of different ways that this manifests itself, but I think we could pull out two specifically here today. And two of the ways that we want to look at this and why it's so hard and difficult for us to love each other in the church today is these two ideas of isolation and individualism. Well, let's start with isolation, shall we? In May 2012, yes, I know this is 9 years ago, but just listen to this because it's still relevant for today. May 2012, The Atlantic released an article called "Is Facebook Making Us Lonely?" by a guy named Stephen March. Listen to what he says and tell me if you don't think this is relevant for our world today. He says, "We are living in an isolation that would have been unimaginable to our ancestors, and yet we have never been more accessible. Over the past 3 decades, technology has delivered us to a world in which we need not be out of contact for a fraction of a moment. Yet within this world of instant and absolute communication, unbounded by limits of time or space, we suffer from unprecedented alienation. We have never been more detached from one another or lonelier. In a world consumed by ever more novel modes of socializing, we have less and less actual society. We live in an accelerating contradiction. The more connected we become, the lonelier we are. We were promised a global village. Instead, we inhabit the drab cul-de-sacs and endless freeways of a vast suburb of information. My goodness, right? We are isolated. We are more connected than ever, and yet we are more disconnected than ever. People are isolated and they're lonely. Some of you might remember maybe a month or so ago, we talked about this book, Faith for Exiles by David Kinnaman and Mark Matlock. In that book, they actually have a chapter on the importance of community and meaningful relationships. And they cite one study, one reference there, where they actually talk about how Americans are now twice as likely to say they are lonely than a decade ago. They are twice as likely to say they're lonely compared to a decade ago. And they say that 1 in 5 Americans says that they are lonely. Now, something really important to pull out here. This was pre-COVID. This was pre-pandemic that this book was written. So there's a good chance that this is even more intense. Now, one of the reasons for isolation, and it came out in this quote, and I think that we would all agree with this, is that screens have isolated us, right? Our phones, our laptops, our iPads, we are so connected, and yet we are so lonely and we are so isolated. We're actually able, we don't have to be human if we're behind screens. People say things that they would never say to someone in person. They hide behind them. They don't really have to be human. And yet we have this problem of isolation that just is pervasive, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And yet we think we're connected, but yet we are so far away from one another. It makes it really hard for us to love each other, to love our neighbor as ourselves, as we hide behind screens, as we isolate. Loneliness is out there. There has to be a way that we help fix that. But not only isolation, there's also this idea of individualism, right? That makes it really hard to love each other, to love our neighbor as ourselves. Individualism is something that's just incredibly pervasive in our world, right? People have their own brands. They have, they want to be this unique individual and make their unique mark on the world. And all those are really good things. But it's also made its way into the church. Remember, the scriptures talk about how important it is for us to love each other and to be in community. And it was written to a group of people. So individualism, while, we are unique individuals, we can't be separated out from the community. Here's, for example, in church, right? Some of you, maybe if you've been around church long enough, you've heard this phrase, a personal relationship with Jesus, right? That actually is language of individualism. Those words, a personal relationship with Jesus, are found nowhere in the scriptures. Now, not that it's bad for you to have a personal relationship with Jesus. You should be praying. You should be reading your scriptures. You should be talking to Jesus, right? Those are good things. But the problem is that when personal becomes private, because that is nowhere to be found in the scriptures. Again, if we go back to Faith for Exiles, there's another study that they reference where they start talking about how a lot of young Christians think that discipleship is this solo effort. 41% of Christians said that I believe my spiritual life is entirely private, and 37% say that they want to be discipled on my own. Well, by definition of what we just looked at in the scriptures, that's technically not possible. You can't do those things on your own. They go on in the book to say that the phrase solo discipleship is actually an oxymoron. And they have this incredibly bold quote, and it's this. It says, if you can do it on your own, it probably isn't church. Well, then what is church? What does it look like for us to love each other in this world of isolation and individualism? What does it look like for us to love our neighbor as ourselves whenever there are so many things that are pulling us apart or that want to force us to just be our own unique individuals and not be a part of a community? How do we remedy that? What does church actually look like? Well, first, and at some level, this is kind of simple, we just have to be together. We have to get used to just being together. And yes, I mean at church on Sundays. Yes, I mean at small groups. But what does it look like for us to just be together outside of those the regularly scheduled programs of what it means to be a part of Christianity, to be a church member, to be a small group leader? Man, I mean, are we celebrating birthdays together? Are we rejoicing with each other whenever there's other reasons to celebrate? You know, are we walking through mourning times with people whenever things are hard? You know, are we just having coffee together? Are we having meals together? Are we texting each other? Are we calling each other? Are we emailing each other? Again, screens, right? But can we redeem those and use them in appropriate ways? But how can we remember to just be together? And really, we have to be creative about what this looks like. You know, like we had to be creative with COVID. You know, people were eating meals outside. You know, we did some online trivia nights where we had families come together. I still remember the young adult women for an online trivia night. They couldn't be inside together, so they were out under the carport at the Kennett campus, and they won the trivia game that night because they were trying to just find creative ways just to be together, to get to know one another. Are we sharing meals together? You know, people are sitting around fire pits, even in the rain, just to be together. We need to remember what it looks like to just be with each other. Do you know who does this better than anybody else in our community? Is the Willowdale and Espanol community. They just love to be together. And then what happens as we just are together, as we be together, you know what happens is that we begin to trust one another. We begin to know that we have each other's back. We begin to realize that, you know what, this person, when I need prayer, I can go to them. When I'm ready to study the scriptures with someone and I have a hard question, I know that they're not going to walk out on me. But it all starts with us just being together, going against this lone wolf spirituality of isolation and individualism. And just being together is so important. But not only being together, what about serving one another? Right? I mean, serving each other is so important whenever we talk about loving each other, we talk about loving your neighbor as yourself. How do you serve each other? For instance, let's just think about one story that I heard of. There was a women's group and they thought, hey, we have a meals ministry. Let's start making chicken pot pies. And so they just made all of these chicken pot pies and they froze them. And they kind of became famous in the meals ministry, right? That whenever somebody would have some tragedy come up or someone would need a meal, these women in this women's ministry's chicken pot pies, these were the things that people remembered. And that's the things that they wanted from our church. It's just awesome because they thought to serve that way. And then when COVID hit, a lot of those chicken pot pies, the group, they had a recipe, they could do them by themselves. They actually ended up feeding a lot of the special needs families with those chicken pot pies. It's awesome that they just thought to serve in that way. You know, if we just kind of, as in another example, just kind of stick with this theme of food, one of the first things that people think about when a tragedy strikes in someone's life is how can we serve them meals? Right? Cooking is just something that kind of you don't think, you don't even want to do whenever you're dealing with a hard thing in your life. And so nothing warms my heart more whenever we hear about a meal train that just got started for an individual or for a family who had a tragedy strike in their life. Man, it's so beautiful to hear that happen. And let me just say, some people have come to us and said, hey, someone ought to start a meal train for them. Yes, someone ought to. It can be you. It doesn't have to be a staff member at Willowdale for it to be, quote unquote, official. But serving people in that way, it's just a way to show them that we love each other, to love our neighbors as ourselves. Even people who are outside of the church are able to do this. But I mean, we experienced this week. Some of you know that I had COVID this past week, and people were calling, people were making late night Walmart runs so I could have Gatorade because the electrolytes really tasted good and helped me. People delivered food to us. Someone even paid for our favorite takeout place to bring us food. People loved us and cared for us, brought games for our boys and just cared for us in unique and creative ways. They loved us. I mean, and these aren't the only ways, right? I mean, nothing says love your neighbor as yourself or love each other like serving each other's children or greeting at the front door or leading each other in worship through music. There are so many different ways that we can love each other by serving each other. But whatever it is, it has to be intentional. Because when we're intentional, it has the biggest impact. It has the biggest impact. One more, I swear this is the last one, reference to Faith for Exiles. They have this portion in the book where it talks about the top relational predictors for resilient disciples. These are the top 4 relational predictors for resilient disciples. Listen to this. I feel connected to a community of Christians. The church is a place where I feel I belong. I feel loved and valued in my church. I feel connected to people older than me in my church. 82% of resilient disciples agree that they are connected to a community of Christians in these ways. 82%. The next layer down, which is habitual churchgoers, people who just go to church out of habit, only 33% of them would say that they're connected in this way. Relationships and loving each other are so important when it's intentional. Marika Springer, who I worked with on this teaching, she said this quote that just really stuck out to me. She said she is convinced that the younger generations, her generation, she works with middle school, she knows a lot of the high schoolers, and she works with our young adult community. She says, I'm convinced that the younger generations and younger communities are going to be drawn back into church by relationships, by loving each other, by caring for each other, by nurturing each other. And we need to be a community of people who can be together and who invites other people in, to go against isolation, to go against individualism, but to be invited into a community where we love each other, where we love our neighbor as ourselves, because by doing that, we fulfill the law. Let's go back to our mission statement. That we love God, we love each other, and we love the world that Jesus, through his people, is working to restore. Why do we love each other? Well, we love each other because we're commanded to. We love each other because he first loved us. We love each other because we'll let no debt remain outstanding among you except the continual debt to love each other. We love each other. We love our neighbor as ourselves. But let's go back and again, just to the bigger picture. We love each other because he is the Lord our God. We go back to Leviticus and we're told to be holy as he is holy. We're told that we are to imitate God. And God loved us by laying down his life for us. And he invites us to do the same, to imitate him, to be holy as he is holy, because he is the Lord our God. That's why we love each other. That's why we love our neighbor as ourselves. No one has ever seen God, but as we love each other, we make God known, not only to each other, but to the world around us. So we invite you to love each other, to love your neighbor as yourself, because he is holy and we are to be holy. We're going to move into a time of communion now. So if you don't have your elements, no worries. You can pause this video and you can go ahead and grab those and then just hit play whenever you come back. We'll be waiting right here for you. But we remember that on the night Jesus was betrayed, he took the bread and he broke it, saying, "This is my body broken for you. Take and eat." In the same way, he took the cup, saying, "This is my blood poured out for the forgiveness of sins. Drink all of it." Amen.
Thanks so much for being a part of our service today. If you are new to Willowdale Online, we want you to know that we would love to meet you in person. We gather together every Sunday on both campuses at 9 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. And if you are considering checking us out in person, why not plan your visit? If you let us know that you are coming, we'll be sure to make your experience as smooth and comfortable as possible. And for anyone who hasn't already done so, I want to encourage you to download our app, where you'll find helpful information on what's happening here at Willowdale. We have lots of opportunities for everyone, of all ages and stages of life to get connected into our community. Visit our website to learn more. And remember that at Willowdale Chapel, our mission is to love God, love each other, and love the world that Jesus, through His people, is working to restore. May we not neglect the significance of loving each other as we love our neighbor as ourselves, and may transform us as a church and in turn transform our community. Que tengas una buena semana. Have a great week.